Red Skelton walked onto the Tonight Show stage on December 6, 1983, and said something in his first 30 seconds that made Johnny Carson forget every question he had prepared. Not a joke, not a punchline. Something quiet, almost accidental, spoken under his breath as he settled into the guest chair. Something only Johnny was close enough to hear. And whatever it was, it made the most composed man in television history reach across the desk and grab Red Skelton's hand and hold it there for a long moment, while the audience sat completely still, unsure whether to laugh or cry. Because what Red had whispered was not a performance. It was the truth. A truth he had been carrying for years, and it had nothing to do with comedy.
But before starting our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
Red Skelton was 70 years old that December night. 70 years old and still showing up. Still walking through curtains, still waving at audiences, still carrying that enormous, generous spirit that had defined him since the very beginning. He had been making America laugh since before most of the people in that studio were born. Radio, film, television, live performance, he had done it all, and he had done it at the highest level for 5 full decades, without stopping, without slowing down, without ever once phoning it in. You do not do that by accident. You do not sustain that kind of career on talent alone. You sustain it on something deeper, in something that keeps pushing you back out in front of people even when the rest of you wants to rest. And that night in December of 1983, Johnny Carson was about to find out exactly what that something was. But first, you need to understand who Red Skelton really was, because if you only know the name, if you only know the broad strokes of the legend, you are missing the full picture. And the full picture is the only thing that makes what happened that night make sense. Richard Bernard Skelton was born on July 18, 1913, in Vincennes, Indiana. His father, a circus clown named Joseph Skelton, died 2 months before Red was born. He never knew him. Not a photograph, not a memory, not a single morning of sitting across the breakfast table from a man who shared his face. His mother, Ida May, raised 4 boys in grinding poverty, taking in washing, doing what she could, stretching what little there was as far as it would go. Red sold newspapers on street corners as a small child to help the family eat. He was performing for tips before he had any idea what performing meant or what it was supposed to look like. He just knew that when he made people laugh, something happened in the air around him that felt like warmth. And for a boy who had grown up with very little warmth in very many forms, that feeling was not something he was going to let go of easily. He left home at 10 years old to join a traveling medicine show. 10 years old. Most kids that age are worrying about school and summer and what their friends think of them. Red Skelton was on the road, learning how to hold an audience, learning how to read a room, and learning all the things that cannot be taught in any classroom and cannot be gotten any way other than by doing them in front of real people who may or may not care whether you succeed. He worked minstrel shows, showboats, vaudeville circuits, any stage that would have him. He was broke most of the time. He slept in places that did not deserve to be called rooms. But he kept going, because the stage was the one place in the world where the son of a dead circus clown from Vincennes, Indiana, could become anything. Where the poverty and the fatherlessness and the years of going without did not define the ceiling. Where the only thing that mattered was whether the people in the seats were laughing. By the late 1930s, Red had found his way to radio, and radio found its way to him in a way that felt almost inevitable in retrospect. And the Red Skelton Show launched in 1941 and became one of the most popular programs in the country almost immediately. Then came the films. Then came television. At his peak in the 1950s, the Red Skelton Show on television was pulling in audiences of 30–40 million people a week. Clem Cadiddlehopper, Freddie the Freeloader, the Mean Whittle Kid, Cauliflower McPug. These were not just characters. They were members of the American family. People talked about them the way they talked about their neighbors. People felt genuine affection for them in the way you feel affection for someone you have known your whole life. Someone whose face is so familiar it has become part of the furniture of your interior world. Red had built something extraordinary, something that very few performers in the history of American entertainment ever managed to build. He had taken all that poverty and all that road dust and all that loneliness and turned it into something that made the entire country feel less alone. But here is what most people watching that night in 1983 did not know. Behind every one of those characters, behind every laugh, behind every pratfall and every mugging face and every bit of physical comedy that looked so effortless and so joyful, there was a man carrying a weight that most people could not even begin to imagine. Stay with me, because what comes next is the part of Red Skelton's story that almost nobody ever talked about. And it is the part that explains everything. In 1945, Red Skelton married Georgia Maureen Davis, a woman he had been devoted to for years. They had 2 children, a daughter named Valentina and a son named Richard Red Skelton Jr., whom the family called Richard. Red adored his children, but Richard, his son, was something particular to him, something that touched a part of Red that none of the applause or the fame or the success had ever quite reached. The little boy, with his father's eyes, and his father's tendency to make everyone in the room smile without even trying at it. Red used to bring Richard to rehearsals, used to let him watch from the wings while the cameras rolled and the audience laughed. People who were there said the look on Red's face when he could see his son watching was unlike anything they had ever seen on a performer. Like he was performing for one person, and that one person was the whole world. When Richard was 5 years old, he was diagnosed with leukemia. There is no way to soften that sentence. There is no narrative device that makes it land gently or at the right angle. Red Skelton's little boy was diagnosed with leukemia at 5 years old, and for the next 4 years, Red watched his son fight a battle that a child should never have to fight, with a grace and a patience and a courage that Red would spend the rest of his life trying to understand and honor. He kept working. What else could he do? The show had to go on, because the show had always had to go on, because that was the only life Red had ever known from the time he was 10 years old on a medicine show stage in the American heartland. But the people who worked alongside him during those years said that something had changed in him, something behind the eyes. The jokes still landed, and the characters were still brilliant. The audiences still went home happy. But there was a weight now that had not been there before, a gravity underneath the laughter that you could feel if you were paying close enough attention. Richard Red Skelton Jr. died on May 10, 1958. He was 9 years old. Red did not cancel his shows. He went back to work within days because grief, for Red Skelton, had no vocabulary other than performance. He had learned that at 10 years old on the road, and he had never unlearned it, and perhaps could not have unlearned it even if he had tried. You show up. You make people laugh. You give them something to hold on to. And somewhere in the giving, if you are lucky, you find a way to keep breathing yourself. The ratings for the Red Skelton Show actually went up in the years following Richard's death. Your America did not know what Red was carrying. They just knew they loved him. They just knew that when he came on the screen, Something in the room changed for the better, and Red gave them that every single night, even when giving it cost him everything he had. This is the man who walked through the curtain on The Tonight Show on December 6, 1983. This is what that 70-year-old man in the dark suit was carrying when he sat down across from Johnny Carson and leaned forward and said quietly, "I am so glad I came. If you are not subscribed yet, please do that right now. And if you are watching on YouTube, hit the hype button for this video. It is a newer feature that genuinely helps the channel reach more people, and it only takes a second. These stories matter, and your support is what keeps them going." Now let's go back to that studio. December 6th, 1983. NBC Studios in Burbank, California. The Tonight Show was taped at 5:30 in the evening for broadcast at 11:30 that same night, and the energy backstage that afternoon was something the crew had not felt in a while. Red Skelton had not made a major television appearance in years. He was not the kind of celebrity who chased the spotlight anymore. He did his live shows, he painted his clowns, he lived quietly on his own terms. When the booking came through, the producers had been genuinely surprised that he agreed. Red was known for doing things when he felt it was right, not when the calendar suggested it would be convenient. Nobody on the production team knew exactly why he had said yes to this particular night, but they were about to find out. Johnny Carson arrived early, as he always did, but he was quieter than usual that afternoon. His longtime producer noted it. Johnny had a quality when an interview mattered to him personally, a kind of internal gathering, a stillness that was different from his ordinary composure. And that quality was fully present on this particular December afternoon. Johnny had known of Red Skelton his entire life. He had grown up in the Midwest, listening to Red on the radio, sitting in whatever room the family radio occupied, laughing at those characters with his parents. Red was not just a guest. Red was, in a very real sense, one of the reasons Johnny had wanted to be in this business at all. There were not many people who could make Johnny Carson feel the particular kind of nervous that comes from genuine admiration, but this was one of them. Red arrived at the studio at 4:15, 90 minutes before taping. He wore a dark suit, a little loose on his frame, his famous red hair now entirely white. The makeup team worked quietly and professionally around him. He was warm and unhurried with everyone he met, learning the names of crew members, asking about their families in a way that made it clear he actually wanted to know. That had always been Red. The guy who remembered your name, who asked the real questions, who made the person in front of him feel seen. It was not a technique. It was simply who he was, and it had been who he was since long before anyone was famous enough to benefit from performing that quality. At 5:20, just before they called him to the wings, Red sat alone in the green room for a few minutes. A stagehand who passed the open doorway later said Red was sitting very still with his hands folded, looking at nothing in particular. Not anxious, not rehearsing, just present, like a man who had made a decision about something and had arrived at a kind of peace with it. When Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio, and the band began to play, and the audience rose to their feet, Red Skelton walked through that curtain with the same unhurried ease that had always defined him. The ovation was immediate and enormous, not the reflexive applause of an audience greeting any celebrity, but something more personal, more specific than that. Something that came from a real place, in real people. The men and women in that studio had grown up with this man. Their parents had grown up with him. So he was woven into the texture of their lives in a way that very few performers ever managed to achieve. And the sound they made when they saw him was the sound of recognition, of gratitude, of something that does not have a clean single word, but that everyone who has ever loved a performer over a long span of time understands from the inside. Red waved and smiled, and did that small shuffling bow, and then he settled into the guest chair and looked at Johnny. And before the first question had been asked, before the cameras had finished their first move, before the audience had fully settled back into their seats, Red leaned slightly toward Johnny and said something quietly. Just the two of them. The audience could not quite hear it. The microphones did not catch it cleanly. But whatever it was, and it went straight through Johnny Carson like something electric. His smile shifted. Something real and unguarded moved across his face, the kind of expression that this most controlled and private of men almost never allowed to happen on camera. And he reached across the desk and took Red's hand and held it. And the audience went very still, unsure what exactly they were watching. What Red had said was simple. "Johnny, I am so glad I came." It sounds simple. It sounds like the kind of pleasantry anyone might offer in that situation. But the people who were close enough to see Red's face when he said it understood immediately that it was not simple at all, and had not been meant simply. There was something in the way he said it, a texture of meaning that went well below the surface of the words. Like a man who had not always been sure he would make it to places like this, and who was genuinely, deeply, quietly grateful to still be here. And Johnny, who had spent 30 years reading people across that desk with a precision that bordered on uncanny, heard every layer of it without being told what to listen for. For the first 15 minutes, the conversation moved the way these things do when two people genuinely respect each other and have real history between them. Johnny asked about the characters, and Red obliged easily, slipping into Clem Cadiddlehopper's voice with an effortlessness that got the studio laughing hard and warm within seconds. That magnificent, rambling country bumpkin, innocent and bumbling and somehow always the wisest one in the room, on delighting audiences in 1983 with the same quality that had delighted them in 1951. Red talked about the early days of live television, when there were no second takes, when the mistakes were as much a part of the broadcast as the planned material, when you learned in real time whether something worked or did not work with no net beneath you and no way to course correct after the fact. He told a story about a sketch that went so catastrophically wrong mid-broadcast that he had no choice but to turn the disaster itself into a bit. And by the end of the story, the whole studio was shaking. But something was building. Anyone watching carefully could feel it. Johnny could feel it. The conversation was warm and the laughter was real, but there was a deeper current running underneath it. And both men knew it was there. And both men were, and in their different ways, moving toward it. Johnny leaned back in his chair. His voice, when he asked the next question, was a little quieter than it had been. "Red," he said, "in all those years of making people laugh, every single one of them, was there ever a time when you wondered if you had anything left? When you were out there performing and you looked inside yourself and the well felt empty?" The studio settled. The laughter from a moment before was gone, not replaced by discomfort, but by something more attentive. The kind of attention that a room gives when it senses that something real is about to be said. Red looked at Johnny for a long moment. Then he looked out at the audience with an expression that was hard to define. Not guarded, not performing, but something in the process of deciding. A man choosing, in real time, and the exact degree of honesty he was going to bring to this moment. And then he chose the full degree. He chose to simply tell the truth. He talked first about the road, about what it had been like to leave home at 10 and build a life one stage at a time, about the way performing had always felt to him from the very beginning. Not like showing off. Never like that. More like reaching. He said every performance was an attempt to reach across the distance between one human being and another, and say something that the ordinary exchanges of daily life did not leave room to say. Something like, "You are not alone." Something like, "I see you." Something like, "Whatever you are carrying tonight, you do not have to carry it by yourself for the next hour." That was the impulse that had driven him from the beginning. The desire to close the distance, to make the space between people a little smaller and a little warmer than it had been before he got there. And then, without flagging it, without building to it theatrically, he started talking about Richard. He talked about his son, the way a father talks about a child who is always present in him, regardless of whether the name gets spoken. He talked about what Richard had been like as a small boy, the specific details, the way he laughed at things that surprised him, the way he used to fall asleep in the car on long drives with his face pressed against the window, the way he would watch from the wings at rehearsals with these enormous, serious eyes, taking everything in, missing nothing. Red said Richard had that quality, even as a very young child, of being fully present in whatever room he was in, of actually being there. "And I used to bring him to the studio," Red said, "and I would be out there working, doing whatever bit we were doing that week, and I could feel where he was standing even when I could not see him. I could feel him watching, and I would think, this is what it is all for. This is the whole point of all of it." He paused. The studio was completely quiet. When Richard got sick, Red continued, "I kept working because I did not know how else to be. Since I was 10 years old, the only answer I knew to anything hard was to get back on the stage. And so I did. Night after night. The characters were the same. The jokes landed. The audiences went home happy. But something had changed in what it meant to do it. Something had gone deeper. He looked at Johnny directly then, and his voice was steady and clear. Richard died in 1958. He was 9 years old. And the night after the funeral, I lay awake thinking about what I was supposed to do with that. Where you put something that size, how you carry it, and still function, still show up, still give people what they came for. And I did not have a good answer. I just had the only answer I had ever had. You go back to work. You walk out into the light. You find something in the audience's face that reminds you that connection is real, that the distance between people can be closed, that this matters. You find that thing and you hold on to it until you can breathe again. Johnny Carson was not speaking. He was doing what the very best interviewers do, which is to recognize when silence is the most generous thing they can offer, and to offer it completely and without apology. He was fully there, fully present, not managing the moment or steering it toward somewhere more comfortable, just witnessing it. Red talked about Freddie the freeloader, the gentle tramp who had been among his most enduring and beloved characters, the little man in the oversized coat, and the battered hat who found dignity where there was none to be found, and beauty in things that the rest of the world had discarded and walked past. Always broke, always hungry, always somehow at peace with being exactly who and where he was. Red said that Freddie changed after Richard died. Not in the jokes, not in the costume, not in anything that an audience could have pointed to and named, but in what the character meant to Red himself when he inhabited it. Every time he put on that coat and that hat and walked out into the light, he was carrying his son. And he was saying something that he could not say in ordinary language. He was saying, the world can take the most precious thing you have, and you can survive it, and you can find your way back to something worth smiling about. And the act of smiling is not a betrayal of the grief. It is the only possible answer to it. The studio audience, by this point, had gone somewhere very still and very concentrated. Not sad, not uncomfortable, something closer to reverent. The kind of stillness that descends when something true has been said in a public space, and the people present recognize it as true in their own lives, and their own losses, and their own private weights that they carry without talking about them. Then Red said the thing that the crew members present would repeat for years afterward, at dinners and in dressing rooms, and in the way that people repeat things they heard once and have never entirely gotten out of their heads. He said, "I have painted a lot of clowns in my life, hundreds of them, and people ask me why clowns, always the clown. What is it about the clown?" And what I tell them is that the clown is the only figure in art who is allowed to carry both things at once, the tears and the smile together at the same time in the same face. We accept that from the clown. We accept that from the clown in a way we do not always accept it from each other. Maybe that is what I have always been trying to do. Give people permission to carry both things at once, to be sad and still show up, to be broken and still laugh. Because the laugh does not mean the grief is gone. It means you are still here. It means you chose to stay. Johnny Carson looked at him for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Red, I think you just described why every single person in this room does what they do. Not just the performers. All of us. We reach out. We try to make each other smile. And sometimes we do not realize until much later that we were being held up by the very thing we thought we were giving away." The audience responded with something that was not quite applause and not quite silence. An exhale. A release. The sound a room makes when something it has been holding finally gets set down in the open. And then Red Skelton did something that nobody in that studio was ready for. He straightened up in his chair, and his eyes went bright, and he said in a completely different voice, "Now, do you want to hear the one about the farmer and the talking mule?" And the studio broke apart laughing. The specific laughter of people who have been moved and then unexpectedly relieved, who have been taken somewhere real and then gently returned to the surface, laughing with gratitude as much as with anything else. Red was off and running, that elastic face working through the story with those expressive hands, every beat landing exactly where it was supposed to land. Johnny barely keeping it together across the desk. And for a few minutes, it was 1954 in the best possible way. That was the gift. That was the complete thing, entire. He could take you to the edge of something true, and then, just when the weight became almost more than the room could hold, he could make you laugh. And the laugh reminded you that laughter and grief were not opposites, but companions. That they had always been companions. That carrying one did not require putting the other down. Red Skelton had known that since he was a boy, with no father selling newspapers on a corner in Indiana, finding that the sound of other people laughing was the closest thing to warmth he had ever been offered, and deciding, without consciously deciding it, that making that sound happen in the world was going to be what his life was for. When it came time for Red to leave, Johnny stood and walked around the desk, which he did not do for everyone, which meant something specific when he did it. He shook Red's hand and held it for a moment, and then, in front of the cameras and the audience and the 30 million people who would watch later that night, he said, "Red, thank you. Not just for tonight. For all of it. For 50 years of showing up." Red looked at him. And then he said it again. The thing he had said at the very beginning when only Johnny could hear it. This time, he said it so everyone could. "I am so glad I came, Johnny. I really, truly am." He waved to the audience one final time. That familiar, generous wave, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world, and walked off the stage. The applause followed him all the way to the wings and kept going after he had disappeared from view. Red Skelton continued performing for years after that night. He toured with his one-man show well into his 80s, filling theaters with people who had loved him for decades and with younger people who had never seen him live and left shaking their heads at the fact that a man that age could command a room that completely. He kept painting his clowns, hundreds of them, and the paintings sold for serious money, and he kept giving large portions of the proceeds to children's hospitals and charitable causes. He married Lothian Toland in 1973 and found something steady and warm in that chapter of his life. He was telling jokes and meaning them the year he died. Red Skelton died on September 17, 1997. He was 84 years old. He had been performing for 74 of those years. At his memorial, someone read something he had written, a short piece, very simple, that described his view of things in the plainest possible terms. He wrote that if by chance you see a clown crying, do not be alarmed. The tears and the laughter come from the same place. The place that knows how much this life is worth, and how fast it passes, and how important it is to never let the people around you forget that they are loved. Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992. In one of his last interviews before his own death in 2005, he was asked about the most meaningful conversations he had ever had on that stage. He mentioned a handful of names, and he mentioned December 6, 1983. He said that what stayed with him about that night was nothing dramatic. No breakdown, no headline moment, no clip that cut easily into a highlight reel. What stayed with him was the image of a 70-year-old man who had survived more loss than most people will ever know, sitting across from him in a dark suit, and meaning it with everything he had when he said he was glad to be there. That, Johnny said, is what I think about when I think about courage, not the absence of weight. Showing up anyway, finding something to smile about on the other side of the grief, and meaning it. Sometimes the people who have spent their whole lives making the world laugh are carrying something the rest of us never see. And sometimes all it takes is one honest question and the real willingness to listen for something to be said that has been waiting a very long time to be said in the open. Red Skelton carried his weight for 84 years, and he never once let it stop him from showing up. He never once let it convince him that the world was not worth the tenderness he brought to it every single night. And that, more than any character or punchline or award or decade of fame, is what made him irreplaceable. Not the talent, not the technique, the decision, made over and over again for 74 years, to use a to walk back out into the light and try to close the distance between one human being and another. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe to the channel right now so you never miss one of these. And if you are on YouTube, please hit the hype button for this video. It is a small thing that makes a real difference in helping these stories reach people who need to hear them. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every single one. And share this with someone who needs a reminder today that the people who always seem fine are sometimes the ones most in need of being asked how they really are. Because Red Skelton understood that better than almost anyone who ever stood in a spotlight. And he spent 74 years turning that understanding into something that made the whole world feel a little less alone. Now you know his story. Pass it on.